morning, all. Thank you.
They're awake.
My name is Charles Kramer, and I'm a member of J Street's Board of Directors. And as a resident of Berkeley, I'm especially delighted to welcome you to day 2 of J Street's first West Coast Annual Summit. Last night, we kicked off the summit with a fascinating discussion by a distinguished trio of leaders and diplomats who discussed the ins and outs of the situation in the Middle East and what the future might hold. This morning, we'll be focusing on what the future might hold for all of us, the members of the pro-Israel, pro-peace movement. What are the actions that we should take going forward? What new avenues of advocacy and organizing can we pursue? How can we ensure that even if the peace process is stalled, our power and voice will continue to grow? Here to offer some of those answers to some of those critical questions are 4 leaders of American organizations striving for Middle East peace. Jeremy Ben-Ami, president of J Street; Daniel Sokach, chief executive officer of the New Israel Fund; Deborah DeLee, president and CEO of Americans for Peace Now; and Ken Bobb, president of Amenu. Each brings years of experience working towards a 2-state solution, and each also brings their own unique organizational approach to helping us get there. Audience can participate in the conversation by tweeting, and you'll be hearing this a number of times, to hashtag JST2014, or to email questions to info@jstreet.org. Tweets and transcribed email comments will be running on the screen during the event. To moderate their discussion, I would now like to welcome Bradley Burston, senior editor at Haaretz.
Thank you very much, Charles. We're going to begin this morning with initial remarks from our panelists, and after each speaks, I'm going to ask them one question. I'm sorry. We're going to begin with initial remarks from our panelists, from each of our panelists, and after each of them speaks, I'll be asking them one follow-up question, and then we'll go on. And we'll begin with Daniel Sokach of the New Israel Fund.
Thanks, Bradley. Good morning, everybody. As the lone Californian on the panel this morning, I want to second Charles's welcome. You know, they say that the country is 10 years behind California. So Jeremy and J Street get it right only 6 years late in recognizing that, you have finally come to the true home base of progressive Jewish America. So you're very welcome. And in fact, as many of you here know, 35 years ago, the New Israel Fund was founded right here in the Bay Area. And so we do see this as your homeland. So I got an email the other day from our allies at the Abraham Fund Initiative in Israel, detailing a terrific accomplishment that they had just achieved. This is just a couple of days ago. They managed to get the Israeli mission to the United Nations, appropriate given our speakers last night, to essentially change their mission statement. The mission statement of the Israeli UN mission had been to represent at the United Nations in the global forum the interests of the Jewish people in Israel and abroad, diasporically. So the Abraham Fund wrote saying, look, we've managed to get the UN delegation, the Israeli mission, to change its statement so that it now acknowledges that it represents the interests of all citizens of Israel, which is great, and the Jewish people diasporically. So the question that we're talking about this morning, Bradley, comes at a great moment. Everyone on this stage and many of us in this room have had to wrestle with the challenge put forward by some that we don't have a right to speak up for the Israel that we believe in, given the fact that we don't live in Israel. But I think it's a very interesting equation, right? Because on the other side of the equation, Israelis and Israeli officialdom often speaks of its role in representing diasporic Jewry. Now, whether or not we agree with this, whether or not we like that, the fact is we are tied together. And there's a lot of recent conversation about the extent to which actions of Israel, policy actions by Israel, impact and affect Jews in the diaspora. So I want from the beginning and I'm sure that this is probably a popular opinion in this room, to dispense with the notion that we don't have a right to speak up for the Israel that we believe in. And I think that moving forward in the next several years for all of our organizations and for all of us, in the aftermath of, in what we assume is the aftermath of the latest round of peacemaking, that this is more important than ever, and that it's not a time to be shy or be muffled in articulating what we believe is best for the Israel that we care so deeply about, but also for the world Jewish community. So, look, the New Israel Fund, speaking from an organizational perspective for just a moment, NIF is in a slightly different position than my friends on the organizations represented by my friends on the panel, which is to say that for us, support of the two-state solution is both a pragmatic and a moral issue, right? We think it is both the best and the right way to resolve the conflict, but it is not the raison d'etre of the organization, right? It is not why we exist, as is, I think, to varying degrees, it is the rationale for your organizations. For us, the individual and collective rights and dignity of all people living in Israel and under Israeli control, supporting those who are advocating and fighting for those rights is the raison d'etre for NIF. It's the moral north for the New Israel Fund. Having said that, it is obvious to all of us, and the reason why the organization takes a firm position affirmatively in support of the two-state idea, is that this is clearly the best and easiest way for us to do our work. So what do we do in the coming years? At NIF, even before the last peace initiative began to collapse, we had begun a process of introspection. And for us, the last 5 or 6 years, according, ironically, with my tenure as the chief at NIF, had been very difficult ones, as many of you know. And we became, in Israel, we were sort of the J Street of Israel, as you and I have joked, right? The answer to the question on the part of many on the Israeli right, what's wrong with Israel today, the answer was often the New Israel Fund is wrong with Israel today, right? So we decided to embrace that, ironically, if you will. And we asked ourselves whether we felt, given the shifting landscape in Israel, and I have described this often to many of you as the rise of an Israeli Tea Party, right? Which is a very different kind of force in the Israeli political debate than we have seen previously, that the rise to power and the sort of dominance in the coalition today of what really is like an Israeli Tea Party has required us to shift our thinking about what we do. And we asked ourselves whether the complement of strategies that we had deployed since our inception 35 years ago remained sufficient to meet the challenges that this changing landscape presented to us. We believe that the work that we've always done supporting human rights groups and women's groups and LGBT groups and Arab Israeli groups, these things are all critically important and still necessary, but not in and of themselves sufficient. And so we have begun over the last year, and now we are implementing a strategic shift where we are trying to work with our brothers and sisters in Israel to lay the groundwork for a new layer of progressive infrastructure in Israel that can amplify and animate progressive voices and build the kinds of institutions that are sadly lacking in progressive Israel, but which here in the United States, in other countries, Australia, and in Germany, in the UK, and Denmark, have been very important in bringing forth a powerful progressive voice that has been able to shift the community debate and the national direction. So we think that our part over the next few years, and we'll speak more about this throughout the day and in the coming months at NIF. Our role in the next few months is to really help seed this new level of progressive infrastructure, which can bring to a whole new level the power of the progressive civil society sector in Israel in order to help it really shift the national debate and the national direction to one that reflects much more closely the values that we all share.
So, Daniel, there's no question that the campaign against the New Israel Fund in Israel was and is an ugly one, and very vocal and very, very visual. But I'd like to ask you how that campaign has affected what NIF is able to do on the ground, some examples of how it affects your work.
Well, it's a complicated question because In many respects, NIF went over the last 5 or 6 years from being a sort of benign, often behind-the-scenes funder, and through our operating arm, Shatil, in Israel, sort of a, if not beloved, then widely accepted presence, institution in Israeli life. And then, as I mentioned earlier, over the last half-decade, that perspective really shifted. But we did a lot of polling, and Camille Fuchs, who is one of Israel's most prominent social scientists, did polling where he found that, in fact, in Israel, the New Israel Fund it plays a role similar to the role that the ACLU perhaps plays in the life of the United States, which is to say that about half the country has now heard of the New Israel Fund. Prior to these rounds of attacks on us, the number was much smaller, something like 11 or 12%. So 40-some-odd% of Israelis now have heard of the New Israel Fund. Of that 40-some-odd%, about 44% say, oh, right, New Israel Fund, you're the communist, vegetarian, right, Arab-loving, right? So, and 34% of the country says, oh, right, the New Israel Fund, you're the people standing in between us and those people who would shred our Declaration of Independence and the values upon which the country is founded. And the remainder have heard of us, but they're not quite sure. And the fact is, as you know, those are pretty good numbers. Israel is not a liberal country in many respects right now. And for NIF to have a third of the population that's actually heard of the organization say, right, those are the good guys, is a pretty good ground from which to do the work. It does have an adverse impact in the sense that my own measurement is I call it the airport measurement, right? When I go into the country and when I leave the country, I can tell a different level. I can see where NIF is in the public eye by the kind of questions I get from the folks who are questioning me, which are never threatening in any way, but are often, sometimes I'll get someone who say, aren't you the people who supported the Goldstone report? And then other times I'll get people who say, hey, thanks for what you did for the LGBT movement. So you can sort of measure it that way. On this side of the ocean, it's been much less complex. And some of you followed the kerfuffle in New York about whether the New Israel Fund should be permitted to march in the Israel Day Parade, which came the same week when the Conference of Presidents determined that J Street ought not to sit at the conference. I believe, and I'm sure we'll talk more about this later, that augurs, those are merely the sort of pre-shocks of what's happening in our, we Californians speak in tectonics, right? But there are shifts happening in our American Jewish community, and I believe that that we're going to see much more of that. But for NIF, the last 5 years, thanks to many of you, have been terrific years for our building this movement in this community in this side of the ocean.
Okay, I want to clarify 2 matters before we go on. First of all, Daniel was not speaking pejoratively of vegetarians or communists.
No, we have many in our ranks.
And the second clarification introduces our next speaker, because 2 of the members of this panel are expatriate Californians, myself and Ken Bob of Amenu.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm a Los Altos High School graduate, went to Berkeley with Bradley, so, I'm glad to be home as well.
Right.
And seeing my
Welcome
mother
back.
and sister, so there you go. Okay, so I'm going to start with a little story. In 2006, I was elected to the World Zionist Organization executive as a representative of the World Labor Zionist Movement, and met one of my co-executive members, then the chair of World Likud, a fellow by the name of Dani Danon. I don't know if that name means anything to any of you. And that's how the World Zionist Executive works. They call it a wall-to-wall coalition. And as members of the executive, you have representatives from all of the ideological, political, and religious movements who identify with the Zionist movement. And I got to know Donnie a little bit. Fast forward a few years, I'm on a Conference of Presidents mission to Israel, and we're having a panel about the peace process, such as it was then. And Donnie was just anti-two-state, and I got a chance to ask a question. I said, well, can you lay out your vision? I'd like to hear your alternative vision. And he came up with a very vague, we're going to wait 10 or 15 years and nurture the status quo until Jordan and Egypt can help us out. And I thought it was really eloquent. And fast forward to last week, and now a deputy defense minister, member of Knesset, Dani Danon, was in Washington lobbying against aid to the Palestinian Authority. Now, I share this story because for 2 reasons. One, to emphasize what we already know, which is that the forces against the two-state solution are just growing louder and more powerful within the current Knesset. And secondly, I think as we have this conversation over this conference, we should be aware of what some Israelis are doing in our own nation's capital in terms of being involved on this side of the ocean. Now, in terms of Ameinu sort of activity in this area, let me just quickly introduce Ameinu for those who don't know about us. We are a progressive Zionist group here in North America with some chapters around the world, which focus on social and economic justice, both here and in Israel, and with an emphasis on the two-state solution and the peace process. Now, in terms of our involvement with the peace process, supporting the peace process, an initiative that we've had underway for some time really addresses how we view ourselves. We're a New York-based organization, not Washington, and we talk about our role, we talk about ourselves as lobbying within the Jewish community and within the Jewish Beltway. And in that regard, we've initiated a project already last year called the Gatekeepers Project, where we have purchased large quantities of film The Gatekeepers, distributed it to national Jewish leadership, Jewish Federation executives, rabbis all over the country, to really try to impact their sense of one we think is one of the real challenges within the American Jewish community today, which people feel that peace and security don't go together. And obviously, we're emphasizing the message that peace actually enhances Israeli security. Our phase 2 of our Gatekeepers Project is now to encourage all of those Jewish leaders, national and local, to actually run programming around the Gatekeepers film. And as some of you may know, that's a harder task than you might think. You know, we recently had a situation in the Boston area where we had a synagogue. Some of our local members in the synagogue initiated the project, got co-sponsorship from the Israeli consulate and the Jewish Federation, but the local chair of the Israel Action Committee still opposed it. It was a one-sided movie. So we're up against some very odd and interesting forces sometimes along these lines. And so we're going to continue with that project, and you'll be hearing more about that in your communities as well. We plan on doing some initiatives here in the Bay Area. Secondly, we have another project at Ameinu called the Third Narrative, which is sort of a two-pronged project. On the one hand, it addresses what we consider the unfair and inaccurate attacks on Israel from the left, and we answer it with a bold sort of progressive Zionist answer. The other piece is actually engaging progressives around this flag of a two-state solution. The piece I want to mention, which is very interesting, you'll hear more about as well, is we've established an academic advisory council. And just this week, our academic council has been discussing how it, as a council, should address the latest settlement building announcements in Israel and how active it should be on those sorts of issues. So those are two issues in particular that I just wanted to highlight here today. Another piece that I want to talk about, and this is sort of the third closing part of my opening comments, is going back to my friend Dani Danon. You know, Dani Danon visiting Capitol Hill and taking a sort of muscular approach to lobbying senators and lobbying members of Congress against the Palestinian aid really highlights, I think, this question that Dan related to as well. You know, what is our right as American Jews to speak about Israeli policy? And you have your example of the UN mission, and I use the example of Prime Minister Netanyahu, who very boldly announced in Congress his last speech that he speaks on behalf of world Jewry. And so if Netanyahu is going to speak on our behalf, I feel very empowered as his constituent to let him know what I think. And in that regard, I think we have some very interesting agenda items in front of us. Ameinu, because of our relationship through this sort of political entity that I referred to earlier, the World Labor Zionist Movement, in addition to our relations with other Israeli politicians, up to this point, we've done a lot of amplifying of those voices in this country. We bring speakers to this country. You know, when we launched Ameinu about 8 years ago, our first tour was with Ami Ayalon, a name that's very well known to the J Street family. Just this past year, we have toured almost all of the young new members of Knesset from Meretz and from the Labor Party, most of them veterans of the social protest movement, who are now making that connection between the social protest movement and the occupation. And we think now we need to really look at next steps in that area. I will share one bit of good news with you today. Camille Fuchs, who Dan just mentioned, his latest survey out today showed that Netanyahu's numbers keep falling in answer to the question, who is most worthy to be prime minister. The poll came out yesterday. He's now down to 29%, and Isaac Bougie Herzog, chair of the Labor Party and leader of the opposition, is up to 17%. So that's actually a big change, and Yair Lapid's at 3%. So So I
Where's
think
Avigdor Lieberman? Where's Lieberman?
he wasn't even on the chart. So, so I think we're seeing some changes in Israel, some positive political changes in Israel in terms of the country being frustrated with the leadership. And I think that we as a movement have to decide where we can go and how we can be involved to impact that political situation as we approach the next round of elections. Thank you.
So Ken, I have a feeling that you're uniquely qualified to expand on one element of one of the efforts to change the situation of the occupation and settlements, and that is that there's been an effort by members of Knesset, in particular Stav Shafir, to increase transparency from huge kind of unknowable bodies like the WZO, the World Zionist Organization, and the Jewish National Fund, and others, who funnel funds to the settlements in all sorts of ways. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the efforts to try to pierce the opacity.
I am actually very involved in this topic. I mentioned I'm a member of the Zionist Executive, which is actually, the WZO is actually the governing body of the JNF, the Keren Kayemet. And we are really trying to break through a history, a long history of these sort of what they call the national institutions, or these quasi-governmental organizations who feel they should be immune from things like transparency, audits. I read an article in the Israeli press yesterday that one of the vice chairs of the Keren Kayemet said, "We're just different because we're serving the Jewish people." And I think that there's a lot of effort going on now. And to be fair, all the different political parties that are involved in this, Israeli political parties, all have their own vested interests. For instance, the settlement department, and I won't go into the intricacies of it, some of the left-oriented bodies there, particularly Meretz and the Labor Party, have had their own kibbutz movements who have benefited from settlement department budgets. So they say, we also benefit from this entity being set up the way it is, so maybe we should also accept the notion of Shah still. But I think that really everyone's realizing now that there is something rotten in these national institutions, and there needs to be an emphasis on transparency and serious audit of their operations.
I'd like to just remind everyone here, while this is going on, please send in your questions and your comments. You can email them, you can tweet them. There are also cards, I believe, that you can give to ushers. You can actually write them in the old-fashioned way with pen and paper. and now we'd like to move along to Deborah DeLee of Americans for Peace Now.
Thank you. I want to thank J Street for giving us all this opportunity. I think it's really a wonderful chance for all of us to share with you our thinking for what's coming at this time. I also want to say, in addition to my work with Americans for Peace Now, I'm proud to be a member of the J Street board. And I'd like everyone to take a look at this whole group, because if you care about Israel's future as a Jewish and democratic state, when I say Jewish, I mean not just as religion, but according to Jewish values, whether it's democracy and human rights, social justice, if you care about supporting the peace movement with boots on the ground in Israel, if you believe the way to do that is to get members of Congress elected by putting your money through J Street and saying, this is what I want you to do when you get there, this is where you make your investment. This is where that's going to happen. And by the way, if you want to read analyses that agree with this and are not afraid to speak truth to power, then read Bradley. Right. We're a peace organization. We support the peace movement in Israel. The peace that we want, obviously, is based on two states. And you may be thinking this is not the easiest time to be a peace movement. I know there's a lot of discouragement out there and beyond. I mean, we hear it all the time. We heard it talking to folks last night and early this morning. I would say two things to you. Number one, we've been here before. And number two, we have never been here before. And we think this calls for talking about things differently and doing things differently. We've talked for years, it's 10 minutes to midnight, it's 5 minutes to midnight, it's 1 minute to midnight. Well, the chimes have already started ringing, and we have to start doing things differently. We are on Tuesday going to be releasing two different two different items. Tuesday is the 47th anniversary of the end of the war and the beginning of the occupation, 47 years of occupation. And so we are releasing, first of all, a document which says that the title of it is On the 47th Anniversary of the Occupation, It's Time for Hard Truths and Tough Actions. I'm not going to go through them all, but I do want to mention a couple of these because we really, although it doesn't go beyond the policies that we've always supported, it uses much harder language, much tougher tone, and it really puts forth the realities as we say them. And we say in the introduction that as a Jewish Zionist organization, it pains us to do this. We use the term, it pains us to do this, which it does. But the reality is we're at the point where we have to use hard truths. So we talk about in the truths, we talk about this being a settler government. We talk about Israel putting a face to the outside world that it does not want peace. We talk about the occupation leading to the brutalization of Israeli and American Jewish mindset. We basically say, and we are only dealing with Israel in this section, we say that the Israeli government has rightly earned the lion's share of blame for the collapse of the latest peace effort, that Israel has basically exploited the asymmetry of power in this conflict to turn the peace talks into a fig leaf, basically to cover actions that kill peace and kill the opportunity for peace. We are a peace organization. We are not a peace process organization. So there may be a pause. For a very long time, we overall have favored process over substance, and we allowed a peace process that we all felt would answer everything to become a fig leaf, to basically hide the fact that Bibi Netanyahu was using this to greatly expand settlements. And the reality is that we cannot concede the future of Israel to the right. And so the campaign that we're launching with this is called Reclaiming Israel's Future, #ReclaimingIsrael. And we've got 6 weeks of campaign. It's going back to the basics of dealing with some substance. We've got one on settlements. We've got one on Jerusalem. We use new technologies to talk about it. We use existing means of communication. We do actions on each of these topics. We'll be asking people to write letters and so forth. But we really feel that one of the most important things that we have to do right now is to really educate everybody who cares about this. We have to be unafraid of talking about this in the way that it needs to be talked about. We have all, and I know each of you out there when you're asked questions, we have all gone through the most convoluted, painful, torturous explanations of what's going on out there using the most nuanced language so that nobody will think that we don't love Israel. The reality is we are a Zionist organization. We love Israel. There would be no reason to be doing what we are doing if we didn't, and we have to talk about the truths out there in order to get a change at this time. Thank you. I won't, let me just, okay, I'm right at the end. I won't go through them now. We have some very strong actions that we're talking about, including the unity government, talking about the Palestinians going to the UN, talking about differentiating between Israel proper and the occupation in making decisions about what you buy and where you put your money. So that's all laid out in this campaign. It'll be out on Tuesday. Thank you.
So my question for Deborah devolves directly from my questions for Daniel and Ken, and that is, how has the political climate in Israel affected the work of Peace Now in monitoring and cataloging the advance of the settlement movement? Because I can tell you, you should know that for journalists and for Israelis as a whole, Peace Now functions as almost the only source of information about new settlement growth, except when the Israeli government wants to punish someone for for some political faux pas and announce the settlements themselves. But that's my question. How does the political climate now in Israel affect how Peace Now works on the ground to monitor the progress of settlements?
Thank you for asking that. I actually think that the climate right now makes it easier, more important, and to get more visibility on the issue of monitoring what's happening in the settlements. The climate in Israel makes it much more difficult to do the kinds of things that Peace Now did forever. I mean, you can't turn out hundreds of thousands of people in demonstrations on behalf of peace. But what you can do is provide information, as Bradley said, that is not being provided elsewhere. It's in many instances made them a target. The price tag campaign, they were among the original targets of the price tag campaign, which is a campaign that right-wing settlers are doing. If we expose something about the settlements that results in the removal of an illegal outpost or some negative reaction some negative action to the settlements or the settlers, they then take out the price on that. So Hagit Ofran, the head of our Settlement Watch project, has had horrible death threats painted on her house, things saying Rabin is waiting for you, and horrible things. We have on our website a timeline of the whole price tag campaign from when it started, what was done against the settlements, and then the price tag action that came in response to it. So what it's created is a real energy and focus, because I think right now everybody, what we've been saying for, years, 47 at least, what we've been saying for years about the settlements, I think is now acknowledged that it's, if not the biggest, certainly one of the biggest blocks to a comprehensive peace agreement. So the focus now and the attention is on Settlement Watch. I would urge you, we have something called a map app. There's nothing else like that out there. We, APN did it in conjunction with Shalom Akshav. You can get it through our website. Which actually shows all of the settlements on a map, and you can zoom in on them. You can see even each of the trailers in some of these settlements, and you can click and it'll tell you the year it was established, what kind, is it ideological, is it religious, is it living, people are there for the cheaper cost of living. And there's flags. So if something's happening in a particular settlement, you look and there's a flag and you click on it and it'll explain what's going on there at the time. We rolled it out about 3 years ago, and the first week we rolled it out, we had 50,000 downloads, not hits, but downloads on it. It's great. I would urge you to use it on settlements. But I think as bad as the climate is, it's actually brought more attention to the work that we do on settlements.
Okay, and now batting cleanup. Jeremy Ben-Ami of Chase Street.
Thanks, Bradley. So I hope that everybody in this audience and everybody who's watching this shares my sense of excitement about this panel for two reasons. The first is that the questions that we're addressing, what do we do now as a movement, what do we do now as activists, are front and center on everybody's mind. I've spoken to probably every single person in this room, it seems like, as I look around the room, about this over the last few weeks. But it is clearly front and center for all of us what exactly we can do in light of the failure of the talks and in light of the political situation in Israel. But the second reason that I'm so excited about this panel is to pick up on Deborah's comments about the notion of working together as a movement. It is so critical that we recognize the commonalities that exist across the different organizations that work in this space and in this movement. There are more than just our 4 organizations out there. There are dozens of wonderful groups that are working on their particular slice of the pie. There are thousands, tens of thousands of activists and donors and volunteers and wonderful folks in this country and around the world and in Israel who share our values and our beliefs. But unless we come together as a movement and begin to think about what do we do as a group, we are not going to be able to beat the real opponents that we have whose ideology is what is threatening not only the state of Israel but our values. So this panel to me is the kernel of what we need to be doing in our communities. We need to be looking not only at these organizations and within the Jewish community. We have allies in the Christian community. We have allies in the Muslim community. We have allies across our communities. And we need to build those coalitions. And I think that's an absolutely critical part of the equation of what do we have to do now. The other thing we have to do, is we have to define what victory is. We are here to win. We're not here to just make a case. We're not here to make ourselves feel good. We're not here to complain. It might be natural in a Jewish gathering, and the bagels were a little stale, I admit. But we're here to win, right? So what does winning look like? What is victory? And I think each organization has a slightly different take given our strategies and our objectives. So I'll just say for J Street, there's clearly two definitions of victory. One definition is here in the United States. It's changing the political and the policy equation here in the United States when it comes to Israel and the Middle East. The second definition is over there, and the victory over there is the achievement of a two-state solution that secures the future of Israel as a Jewish and a democratic home for our people. So that's the two definitions of victory. And we have to admit, while we're doing a fairly good job, I feel good about the progress we're making on the first definition of victory, changing the politics and the communal discussion here. We're having some tough times over there, right? And we are here because we recognize that in light of the failure of the Kerry effort, that we've learned one critical lesson that was a key premise of J Street about American leadership, that American leadership is necessary, but it's not sufficient. The Secretary of State of the United States can't be the person in the room who wants a peace deal the most. And we have to recognize exactly what APN is standing up and saying, and what all of us are beginning to say, which is that as long as this is the government of Israel that we're dealing with, as long as this is the set of policies, that we aren't going to make progress, and there has to be some form of political change, either a new coalition or a new government, in order for there to be actual progress towards a two-state deal. So that raises a really difficult question. We're sitting here in the Bay Area. We're sitting in the United States. The majority, overwhelming of us are American citizens. What's our role? We don't vote there. Our kids aren't fighting in the army. We're not walking into the cafes and riding the buses that could blow up if there's another intifada. So what is our role? And that is the big challenge that we all get. And how do we bring our message to Israel? How do we bring it to our friends and our families in a way that expresses our love and our concern and the fact that we're all in this together? How do we sound the alarm? How do we act as that alarm clock that wakes people up over there and says, this is the direction that you're going in? Some will say that you have to go towards a path of BDS, that you have to go towards boycotts and divestment and sanctions and negative punishment that raises the cost and drives home that this is a path that has consequence. But that's not the path for J Street. That's never going to be the path that we go down. We believe that there's a better way. We believe that there's a better way to talk to friends and family than to wield a big stick and bash people over the head. We have to talk to them out of love and out of concern, and we have to bring our message in a way that will really resonate. So here are five things that I think we need to do. Number one, we have to get the leaders of our community. It's not enough for us to be out here. We have to convince the rabbis. We have to convince the heads of the federations. We have to convince the leaders of our community that this is the correct path and that they must join our call too. We have to be a bottom-up movement within our community to change the messages that our community as a whole is sending to Israel. We have a lot of work to do in our own community vis-a-vis our own leadership. Of course, the Conference of Presidents vote is only one expression of that. We can discuss that more, but we need to mobilize and work with our community leaders to get them on board with our message and start to get them to help us with that wake-up call. Second, we need to do the same thing on the political side. We need more than expressions of displeasure from the White House and the State Department. We said in our statement yesterday, and I think this is also where APN is headed, that it isn't enough after 47 years to just issue statement after statement expressing displeasure about the possible illegitimacy of the settlement enterprise. We need the United States to really think very carefully about what more it can do than issue those expressions of displeasure. And so we're going to do some thinking about that ourselves. As J Street, we're engaging with a lot of you in these chapter check-ins to say, what is it that the United States could be doing? What are concrete steps to indicate that this occupation and this expansion of settlements is counter to the political interests of the United States, and we need to convey that in a political manner, in a policy manner, government to government. So that's the second area. Third, as Joanna Goodwin said last night, part of our call to action is we have to tell our representatives in Congress to do no harm. The notion of trying to be so pro-Israel that we are going out there and cutting off security assistance to the Palestinians who are working with the IDF to ensure there isn't terror in Jerusalem and that cafes aren't blowing up. We're being more pro-Israel than the Israeli government, which continues to work on a security basis day in and day out since the formation of the unity government with the Palestinian security forces, and our members of Congress are calling for a cutoff of the security money. This doesn't make any sense, and we need to make sure that we aren't adding to the problems that we're trying to help to solve. Fourth, we need the administration and the secretary not to back down. Of course, what they just did didn't work. We're all aware of that. But the answer to that isn't to step back, it's to step forward with new ideas and bolder, better leadership. I loved what Ambassador Kurtzer had to say last night. I think he laid out the rationale for putting forward an American framework. It's something that J Street supports. The United States can take the lead. The United States can step out with a marker that even if the present governments of both the Israelis and the Palestinians can't reach that marker, the United States can lay down clearly a sense of what it is that it will take to achieve a two-state solution, and that's what leadership looks like. And finally, we as a movement have got to speak directly to Israelis, but we have to do it in a way that says, you need to understand where we are coming from. We can't be telling them what to do, but we can be making it very clear that the patience of a large portion of the world and a large portion of the American Jewish community has run out with the occupation, has run out with settlement expansion, and we have a right to make our views known and to have people in Israel hear very clearly where the rest of the world is at. It's not telling them what to do, but we are telling them what we are thinking, and we have every right to do that. So that's how I see our agenda shaping up. I think we have to do it all together, each in our own way. We're all one piece of a larger puzzle, and all of our strategies working in concert, I think, can make a difference in shaping a future that is good not only for Israel, but for the Jewish community.
So this year, more or less, the collapse of the Kerry Initiative coincided with the vote at the Conference of Presidents. And bearing in mind that in the Hebrew language, the word to and the word for are the same word, I'd like you to talk a little bit about what the decision of the Conference of Presidents to reject J Street has done to and for J Street.
So I think it's very important to recognize that the vote said a lot more about the Conference of Presidents than it said about J Street. And the issue that J Street has been trying to raise all along is whether or not the voices that have been established for decades in our community actually speak for our community and speak for us. And we've said that in reality, there is a large segment of our community for whom those voices don't speak. And we've said the doors are sometimes closed, the tent is too small, the range of acceptable discourse is too limited. And I think that this vote made that case for us. And I think that there's a real strong movement within the conference, and two members of the conference are sitting to my left. Americans for Peace Now and Amenu are...
Not to your far left, though.
Not to my far left. I'm trying to think of where to go with that, but I'm not. And maybe we can get into this a little bit, but I think that the most important thing that comes out of the vote is a reconsideration by the conference of the way in which it operates and the way in which it sets its rules for membership, but more importantly, the way in which it sets its policies. Right? How does it determine what is a consensus view within the American Jewish community? So if the conference says something, let's say, about the new legislation on Iran sanctions and speaks on behalf of our entire community, how does that actually come about? What process is used for determining that the conference gets to say the American Jewish community supports additional sanctions on Iran in the middle of negotiations that could derail the deal and lead to a war? That's not where this community is at. And who decides that that's the way in which the conference policy is set? So for me, the significance isn't so much about what it's done for J Street or to J Street. The real significance is, have we sparked an internal discussion within the conference about the way in which it operates that leads to real significant change, ultimately, hopefully opens the door to an organization like J Street then applying and getting in, but that's a whole separate matter. The more important thing is that the conference needs to speak actually on behalf of the American Jewish community instead of a narrow segment of the American Jewish community.
Well, I'm gratified to report that your comments are coming in. They're also coming in by email and Twitter. So please go on, whichever medium you'd like to send your message. In this next segment, we're going to open the conversation, and I'd like to begin with a subject that we could certainly spend an entire weekend debating, which is the movement to boycott, divest from, and sanction Israel, the BDS movement. Given our time restraints, though, I'm going to set out 3 questions, and I'd like to ask the members of the panel to relate to any or all of them. Okay. First, one of the arguments made most often by the advocates of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement against Israel, especially now that the peace process is where it is that this is the only possibly effective, non-violent means of fostering change in Israel's position. So the first question is, if you don't boycott Israel, what other concrete alternatives are there? I know you've spoken to that question already, but feel free to go on. Secondly, how do you respond to the person who comes to you and says simply, why not boycott Israel? And third, in your view, this summer with, I know that there's a record number of concerts in Israel beyond the ability of any Israelis to attend them at this point. But on a real level, in academia, in all of its aspects of BDS, how is BDS really doing right now, this year? Is it making headway? Is it treading water? Is it failing? Okay. So whoever would like to go first is fine.
We're all just dying to jump in on this one.
I'll start, because we're in a unique position. We have a different position from everybody else on the stage, at least organizationally, on this issue. We spent a lot of time out speaking against BDS, against Israel, in synagogues and on campuses and so forth. But we joined Peace Now in Israel in a campaign to boycott settlement products. And we also in this document explain our support or our urging of governments, other governments, to differentiate between support for Israel proper and support for the occupation, to differentiate between Israel proper and the occupied territories. We believe that in many ways it actually helps people not involve themselves in BDS because it gives them an alternative, it gives them a way to feel they are taking some action, they are expressing their displeasure with the occupation. And we also believe that if you agree that settlements are the problem, then you should not be investing your money and so forth in it. Are the boycotting settlement products, certainly in the United States, having an impact No, I mean, other than for those that feel that we're taking an action and we're doing something. I think in Europe and in other places there is some impact on it, but and I think it's going to continue to increase. I mean, people who are so frustrated with the occupation and the continued isolation of Israel around the world, it is going to continue. I should say one other thing. We initially got involved with this campaign because there was a bill moving through the Knesset that allows for an Israeli individual to be sued if they say that they boycott settlement products. That they can be sued for damages by someone in the settlements without having to prove that any damages existed. So Shalom Akshav did a campaign saying, "Sue me, I support settlement products," and we joined them in that, and we've extended that somewhat to include boycotting, in essence, the occupation, but certainly not BDS. So I think that as things continue to get worse, the BDS movement is going to continue to rise. I think it's a challenge for us to be able to continually explain the difference, that we do not and will not support BDS against Israel, but we believe that there is a place to boycott, to refuse to support financially, economically, for governments through trade and other agreements, the occupied territories and the occupation.
Bradley, I want to just add to that. The bill that Deborah mentioned was one of three bad bills, as we call them at NIF, in the 18th Knesset of blessed memory, where there were several score of these bills that were working their way through. I'm very proud that NIF, through our Shatil organizing arm and our flagship grantee, the Association for Civil Rights in Israel, provided the lobbying forces against these bills. All of the bills but three were defeated. But one of the three bills that passed was the so-called Chok Cherem, the boycott bill that you just mentioned. So this is not only a bill, this is a law in Israel. It is being challenged. It is not, it's very unclear what's happening. Our grantees are challenging it. We have many friends in the Knesset who fought very hard against it, who are pushing back as well. But let's be clear, unfortunately, it's no longer a bill. For that reason, NIF took a position that was parallel to APN's in the Israeli sector. We said that we would, of course, not change our support for our grantee organizations that were working not only against Chok Cherem, but who felt as Israelis that they wanted to support or call for or participate in a boycott of settlement goods and products. I want to just put something out on the table because, and I'm not sure what we can do with it in our time, Bradley, but we have all seen the BDS question become the great monster in the community right now. I speak, as my colleagues I know do as well, with leaders from all walks of American Jewish life. A lot of the big federation leaders, a lot of the big organizational leaders really agree with us. The extent to which they feel that they can say this publicly, of course, varies wildly. But to a person, they either have sort of bought the party line about BDS being the greatest enemy of the Jewish people since Amalek, right? Or they recognize that this is a loaded topic, but they don't even want to go there. And to a certain extent, I think that informs, if I'm being totally candid, what a lot of us in the room feel like. It's not an easy argument to win on. The nuance that Deborah and APN are trying to thread a needle with in this country, that we stand for in Israel, is very, very difficult at a time when some in the establishment have labeled boycott, divestment, and sanctions as the boogeyman. I think that there's a great critique that we can all have of the BDS movement as such, but I think that for our purposes right now, what behooves us all to do is to offer alternatives to our community that, frankly, I believe are going to be far more effective, starting with your position on the settlement goods and products, but moving towards the things that you all outlined in your program of Response Now, and what I mentioned earlier at NIF, where we are, again, moving from a phase where we seeded and funded and built a civil society sector to a phase where not only will we do that, but we will try to turbocharge a level of infrastructure, applied progressive think tanks, media monitoring outfits, multi-issue digital organizing platforms, things that are not currently up and running in the Israeli civil society sector, but which our brothers and sisters on the progressive side of the aisle need to win in Israel. And that, far more than the BDS movement, is going to be what changes Israel if something does.
I'll just add a couple thoughts. I'm extremely sympathetic to the settlement boycott approach, and have my own shopping choices, as they say. I have to say that I think it's ineffective for our work in moving the dial, particularly in the American Jewish community. And that's why my organization, Amenu, has not come out on this issue, and this may not be a particularly popular point of view here, but going back to Jeremy's comments earlier in the first round of, we don't want to just complain, we want to be effective, we're just trying to be effective. And I think that it's just talking about settlement boycott and BDS and making that distinction gets to be a lot of what we like to call inside baseball. Trying to have that conversation with people in the American Jewish community is very, very difficult, and we've come to the conclusion, I personally come to the conclusion, it's actually not the most effective way of having impact here in the American Jewish community. So, thank you. That's my approach, and I think we all have to be careful not just to do things that make us feel good, but also help us be effective and move the dial. Now, going to the second piece of what we can do, there's an enormous amount we can do. Daniel's referred to some of the important projects New Israel Fund supports. Amenu has its own Israeli, what we call strategic social justice partners. Ambassador Kurtzer yesterday spoke about soft power. There's a whole array of projects we can do out there and support the forces of good in Israel that are positive steps. So my favorite slogan of all of this goes back to an early J Street U campaign, invest, don't divest. And I would suggest whatever that means to all of us, what should we be investing in? In civil society in Israel, in the peace movement supporters in this country, there's a lot we can recommend to people to do that doesn't include the negative. And I think in terms of winning hearts and minds in the American Jewish community, it's the right approach.
So just picking up on the three questions, you asked, is BDS the only effective tool? I would tend to agree with what we've heard so far, that it actually isn't particularly an effective tool. It isn't the only effective nonviolent means, and so we've chosen to go down other paths. When somebody says, why not boycott Israel, the reason is that the BDS movement hasn't been able to make the distinction that Deborah's making. The BDS movement basically has as part of its generic rhetoric that there really isn't justice and a right of the Jewish people to a nation state of their own. The premise of J Street is there is a right and there's justice in a nation state for the Palestinian people. But there's also justice and right to a nation state of the Jewish people. And unless the broader BDS movement is able to swallow that and to start to talk about the right of both peoples to nations of their own, then anything that we do that is seen to be backing up that movement is unfortunately cutting at the very heart of one of the basic principles of J Street. And as far as how is BDS doing, well, I think it is making some headway. And I think it is gaining ground, particularly in Europe. And I think one of the things that we can say as part of our alarm clock, as part of our wake-up call to folks, our family and our friends in Israel, is that this tide is coming, that this wave is coming, that this is going to gain steam and patience is running out, and this is the kind of thing that's going to come. We're not going to be a part of it, but look at the horizon and look what's coming your way. And it's very, very important for us to be part of that warning and be part of that alarm that is telling people that it is gaining some traction and it is starting to be a place where there's a real and serious threat coming.
Okay, now we're going to turn to questions from you. And the first one is, how do you think pro-Israel Americans can motivate the Israeli public to be engaged in a change of the status quo? Should Americans do this?
Yes.
Ditto.
And how?
Well, we've spent the last hour, I think, talking about how to do it. Watching what happened in New York a few weeks ago, whereas I mentioned from, not only was J Street being rejected from the conference, but also there was this manufactured kerfuffle about the participation of NIF and some of our allies who were here in marching in the Israel Day Parade. And what was interesting and heartening about both of those incidents is what happened next, right? As we all know, the reform movement, the conservative movement, and other major players in the Jewish community responded quite strongly to J Street's rejection at the Conference of Presidents. And in the case of the Israel Day Parade, the Federation and the JCRC in New York stood up firmly and steadfastly in supporting the right of progressive pro-Israel people to participate in that parade. So I think that these are good signs, and what we need to do is also be Look, too often those of us who feel who on our side of the aisle don't come out there and support those people in the establishment who are taking courageous stands, right? And I think that this is a time for Rick Jacobs and the leader of the Reform movement, the leaders of the conservative movement, the federations who are actually acting with courage to protect the right of all of us to say what we want in the community. We should be offering them support, and we should be doing it publicly. And I think that this needs to then be communicated to Israel. I think it is in some ways, but I think it's very important that I forgot who said it, but that earlier someone mentioned that there needs to be a way of communicating to our Israeli cousins that the community here, it was Jeremy, it was you, is losing patience, is running out of patience with what's happening on the ground in the settlement enterprise and the occupation. And we need our job should in part be to get our establishment organizations to be gently but firmly communicating this back to Israel.
I just want to add one word on that. It's interesting. After the J Street Conference of Presidents vote, I got a number of calls from different Israeli political figures asking for my understanding of what happened. So it was in the press there, and they were interested. And I want to take advantage of this audience to make a step for transparency in the American Jewish community and announce something that has not been in the press, and that is that the Conference of Presidents has set up a committee to look at its bylaws and processes, and I've been appointed to the committee. And I mention this, and I mention this because these things should be announced. And the fact that the committee's been announced and there's actually members appointed and still no one's heard about it is just wrong. So spread the word.
And I think just, the question gets at the heart of it. What will motivate Israelis, right? Because I just came back from Israel, and many of you have been there recently too, and life is good, right? And you go to Tel Aviv and you visit with your family, and you go to the cafes and you go to the beach, and life is going on, as they often say, in the bubble. So what pierces the bubble? And is it threats and BDS and saying we're going to boycott you? I think no. That reinforces this sense over there that the world's against us, everybody hates us, everybody's out to get us. I think we have to work in partnership with the business community that has launched this Breaking the Impasse initiative, the top CEOs of Palestine and Israel working together to make the case that for the economy it's so important to end this conflict. We have to work with the security leadership, the folks on the Council for Peace and Security, the gatekeepers and others who say for Israel's security it's so important to do this. We have to work in tandem with the leaders of Israel and the leaders of Israeli society to build that sense of urgency and that isn't there now, but do it out of love and do it in a way that has a chance of getting people's ears rather than turning them into a defensive crouch.
I think most of it's been said. Again, we rely on Shalom Akshav for most of that and for the information that they produce. So we don't speak directly to the Israeli people, except for the fact that I think that one of the most important things that we can all do in this period of time is really to educate. I'm sure you've had experiences when you've talked to people, I know we all do, when you speak in a synagogue or someplace and people come away saying, I didn't know that. And we have to realize, for those of us who are doing this work and those of you who go on trips with any of our organizations to Israel, we have seen more and we know more about what is going on in the settlements related to the security barrier. And so we really need to educate, because when people know the facts, other than the ideologues and those that will only defend Israel regardless of what the situation is, when people will know the facts, they will start thinking differently, not about today where they're comfortable, but about what future is ahead for Israel.
Okay, great. The second question, somewhat different direction. How should I react? In fact, there's two questions here which are on the same subject about the American Jewish community, so we'll ask them together. How should I react when my rabbi pushes Apex positions and J Street is never mentioned? And the second question is, should J Street locals focus their organizing efforts on the established Jewish organizations like federations, JCRCs, etc., or on the vast numbers of unaffiliated Jews? And even though these are questions that are directed about J Street, there's no question that I'm sure you all have a tie to this. Have at it.
Well, I'll start. So we run into this all the time, that there are rabbis and communal organization leaders who have a particular point of view and open up their institutions to one side of the spectrum and not the others. And I think it is extremely important for us to be actively working institution after institution, synagogue after synagogue, to work with those leaders to understand that we're not asking them to shift their ideology. We're not asking them to change their mind. But what we are asking them to do is to recognize that the Jewish community as a whole, and their institution in particular, will be a lot stronger and healthier if they open up the space to debate and discussion and to different points of view. They will be shocked to find that if they have somebody who would agree with this panel and somebody who would agree with a more right-of-center perspective on a panel together at a synagogue, they will get double the number of people to come out for a program when it relates to Israel. And that is a fundamental challenge for the Jewish community, is how do you engage people these days in Israel? That's something that the whole community is worried about. One of the answers is you don't try to shove one point of view down their throat. You actually open it up and you show what a fascinating and vibrant topic of discussion this is. It's a matter of politics and policy and history and values. This is a fascinating conversation, and it's one that should be engaging our community, and growing their institutions. So I think that's the pitch to institutional leaders, whether they are rabbis or not, about how to open up the gate. In terms of J Street's advocacy, I think that the number one thing that we as our organization brings to this that is so critical is our work in the political and policy world. And that's where I would urge people to really focus their effort. We want to make sure that our elected officials, candidates for office, are hearing from us. I'm going to pick up on this question of what was the message to Rick Jacobs. And he's not a political leader, but I just use it as an example. For Rick Jacobs and the conservative movement leaders who stood up for J Street on the conference vote, they got full-page ads in Jewish papers from the opponents. Did they hear from the supporters? No. Were there full-page ads from those saying thank you to Rick Jacobs and thank you to the conservative leaders? We have to do a lot better job of thanking those who are with us and letting those who don't agree with us know where we stand. But I'd focus our efforts primarily in the policy and political worlds. That's what J Street's piece of the puzzle is, primarily, with some level of communal work.
I think there's a deeper, more complicated challenge that's implicit in the first question. Maybe some of you remember a couple of years ago, a prominent conservative rabbi, a bit of a neocon who now lives in Israel, called Danny Gordis, made a statement to the effect that he believed that that young rabbis in his conservative movement were not as pro-Israel and connected to Israel's older rabbis. So the great Arnie Eisen, chancellor at Jewish Theological Seminary, took him up on the challenge and did a very extensive poll of his own rabbinate, people who were in the seminary, 10 years out into their rabbinate and up to 20 years out. And what he found, not surprising to any of us, was in fact young rabbis are just as connected to Israel as older rabbis. In fact, because of day school education and the Year in Israel program, they're even more connected in some respects. They're just more liberal, right? But what he also found, and we loved this at NIF, we thought one of the questions asked, how do you feel about the most important Israel organizations? And we sort of thought that we would see older rabbis tilt one way and younger rabbis tilt another way. And what we found was that the interesting thing was, while that was true, the majority of conservative rabbis in the conservative movement chose NIF as the organization they felt best about. Now, I'm not saying that as a bragging right here with my friends on the panel.
Come on, just a little bit.
Just a little bit. But rather to set up the point I want to make, which is that I think the problem that we all have has less to do with rabbis who disagree with us than with, because I think most rabbis who know, not all certainly, but the situation on the ground is as best as anyone in the Jewish community in this country. The problem is something we have not yet mentioned. And the problem is the problem of money and funders and funding, right? And the problem is, right, the problem is who's behind those rabbis, the fear that those rabbis feel, right? So when I was executive here at the Federation, surprise for those of you who didn't know, for about a year, about 6 years ago, I once met with a group of, must have been 40 rabbis who were gathered in a room representing almost every major conservative reform and Reconstructionist synagogue in the Bay Area, who all said, we're afraid to say what we really think at the pulpit. And my first reaction was, it's all of you. How can you be afraid? But of course, what they were afraid of was what their big donors and their big supporters would say. Now, everyone on this panel has been asked the question that I get asked everywhere I speak, right? Where is our Sheldon Adelson? So my answer is, you are our Sheldon Adelson, right? And so I think what we have to do, not only to Rick Jacobs, and you're absolutely right, that is a sin of omission on our part, which we ought to correct, right? But what we have to do is to make sure that the rabbis at our synagogues know that we have their backs, right? And that we're not willing to walk away if a big donor says, look, I'm going to withdraw the building, the capital campaign donation I'm going to make. We need to take the hard decisions to really counter that. And that's where we can be most effective.
I'd like to, I think there's another outcome for this fear that's happening, which is not just that a number of rabbis are only presenting the AIPAC position, but that many, many rabbis are not dealing with Israel at all in order to avoid the controversy. We did a joint campaign with J Street and Trua calling on rabbis to sign a petition to say that they were going to be dealing with issues around Israel, that they were going to expand the discussion and allow all voices to be heard. We offered materials, we offered consult. We have a rabbi on our staff, our Director of Strategic Communications, Alana Suskin, and she's been getting calls from rabbis who signed on to this petition asking for her one-on-one, guidance and consult on how do I talk about this, how do I hear all voices, how do I let this discussion be aired? Because I think they're both a problem, one in presenting only one side, but also in, just not touching the issue when it's so critical to Jews.
I'm just going to add 2 quick points because a lot of good stuff has been said on this question. So in terms of the AIPAC rabbi, that's why we chose at Amenu this Gatekeepers project, because we figured it's something you can't say no to. I didn't mention also we have a great viewing guide written by the Forward journalist J.J. Goldberg that we put together for this project, and this is an advertisement. If you would like to do a project like this at your synagogue or wherever, give me your email address afterwards and we'll do it, because it's very hard. Matter of fact, this fellow who was at the synagogue I mentioned in the Boston area, the head of the Israel Committee, he is an AIPAC activist. I didn't mention my remarks on purpose, but now that's been brought up. So we contacted the New England office of AIPAC, and they said, gatekeeper, sure. So AIPAC's not going to keep the Gatekeepers movie out. So I really urge you to take this up. It's a way to disarm this problem the rabbi might have, but it does obviously make our case. The second part of the question didn't get dealt with. Should I deal with my more organized Jews or my unaffiliated Jews? Obviously the answer is both, but you need different tactics for both. And where Jeremy, I think, is right, and I'm also on the J Street board, so I appreciate his answer on where the J Street priority should be. I think we as Jewish communal activists really need to be out there and bringing in those people who are disaffected. It's a hard job, we know that. It's even hard to find them. One of the reasons we launched this Third Narrative Project is it speaks to progressives about Israel in a way that they can actually understand and accept, unlike some of the other organizations I won't mention. So I think it's a tough haul, but particularly in the Bay Area and some of these communities, more liberal communities, we need to be going after those unaffiliated Jews and giving them a home.
Okay. So we have time for brief answers to one more question from you, and that is, shouldn't we consider supporting the Palestinians' quest for recognition at the UN?
Well, look, we talked earlier about effectiveness. The Palestinians went to the General Assembly. They won a vote by, 130-something to 20-something. I mean, the world is clearly recognizing a non-member state. The only thing that state doesn't have is membership in the United Nations, which is a Security Council issue. The day after the vote, there was a little celebration in a square in Ramallah, and everybody hoisted up a banner celebrating the recognition, and then the occupation went on. And so I just ask for all those who keep coming back to, well, isn't the answer to get UN recognition, what is the impact of UN recognition? The only impact that is going to end this occupation is when Israel ends this occupation. And the first country to introduce Palestinian membership to the United States needs to be Israel. Israel needs to be the one that makes that move. And until that happens, the rest of the world can do whatever it wants, but the occupation isn't going to end. So I just don't see this focus on going back to the UN as an answer. I think it may feel good, and people may want, for instance, J Street to support the Palestinians in doing that, but at the end of the day, even after it happens, and it already happened, the UN did give this recognition by an overwhelming majority, it didn't change conditions on the ground. And I think what the focus of this panel has been, and a lot of our work needs to be, is what is going to effectively move us toward a two-state reality and to an end of this occupation.
We believe that, as Jeremy says, this may not be the best strategy. We believe that the Palestinians certainly have the right to go to the UN. We believe it's not a rejection of negotiations, but it's a sign of the failure of negotiations. We also believe that it is nonviolent if it's done in keeping with the two-state and the Clinton parameters, that our government should have no choice but to support that effort.
Only thing I would add is we heard last night some discussion of the role of the UN, and I think it was very instructive. Ambassador Shalev, who gave a wonderful support for both J Street and two-state solution and the impact of what we do, did point out how Israelis view the UN. For better or for worse, I think she very accurately portrayed it. So if, again, we're looking to build partnerships with our colleagues in Israel, many of them will say, and most of them said, listen, the UN is sort of a dead letter, for Israel. So I think we have to be aware as we work to be effective with our political allies in Israel as well. I do think that Ambassador Kurtzer, in his suggestion of a potential new Security Council resolution, raised a different look at the UN that I'm interested in learning more about as we go through this conversation.
Yeah, thankfully, the questions about the geopolitics of the UN are beyond the purview of the New Israel Fund. But look, I would echo what you all said and say that if you really are heartbroken and terrified and passionately engaged as you all are, the thing to do is to make the investment that Deborah said at the beginning of this session, and to look at the ways that you can support the pro-Israel, pro-peace movement here through these three organizations in this country, and through some of Ameinu's work and NIF's work, support your Israelis who are working on the ground every day to make the real change, not the symbolic one that will bring the occupation to an end and a two-state solution to reality, if anything will.
I'll clap for that.
Okay, are you all sitting down? Well, not all of you, but it's okay.
Sit down.
We'd now like to ask you to take 5 minutes and talk to one of your neighbors or two of your neighbors,
Okay.
and come up with a comment or a question to J Street. Something that concerns you, a suggestion where J Street should be going from here on. Whatever comes to mind, 5 minutes. You can, once again, tweet it, email it, or write it on a card. Go.
And then we'll come back to you.
Yeah. Yeah, this is not the end, by the way, and before just so you know, there will be more after this. Not done, not done.
Not done.
deadline. That's good. That's great.
Are you going to ask for any closing comments?
I've got a closing comment, but Deborah wants to tell a joke. Like the stock exchange. I think this worked. That's about it. Yeah. Okay, we're just about to finish here.
I won't finish the rest.
We're about to have to ask you to put down your number 2 pencils. If you have cards that haven't been picked up, please raise them now. Once again, the last questions, please. Cards, questions, anything? A few more over here. I'd like to say that I can't thank you enough for your willing suspension of American decorum. Made me feel right at home. It was just more proof, if any were needed, that J Street tends not to do things exactly the same as other organizations. And in that vein, we have a joke from Deborah that she's asked to offer.
Well, I just wanted, before we close out, I wanted to share with you something that always works for me when I go out and speak to groups and they feel that the peace process is dead, that the peace movement is dead, that the whole hope for peace is over, because I know a lot of us have been feeling that a lot lately. And when that happens, I want you to call to mind, many of you know this story, the story of the priest, the minister, and the rabbi who were all talking about what they wanted people to say at their funeral. And the priest said, at my funeral, I want people to say that I shepherded the Catholic Church through the terrible crises that it was facing, and that we came out stronger at the end. And then they asked the minister, and the minister said, at my funeral, I want people to say that I brought many souls to Christ, and that people found themselves and found their way to heaven. And the rabbi looks at his friends and he says, at my funeral, I want people to say, look, he's alive! So we're alive, you're alive, we have a lot left to do.
So in closing, I promised my wife that I would share with you a message that came out of a conversation that we had just before I left Israel to come here to her city. And it's a message to you and also to all of you. And it's simply, thank you. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, that is, for still believing that Israel can get better and that Israel might even be able to get well. The end of the message is, come to Israel more. Talk to Israelis. As difficult as it often is to communicate with the people here and the people there, remember that they're your people. You know, they're but for fortune. Listen to them. Talk to them. You know, they're turning off the water in Cholon for people who can't pay their water bills.
Not anymore.
Well, if they turn it back on for the woman with the 4 children, they're going to turn it off for someone else. Cholon is enormously important. It's as important as Hebron. It is. So come to Israel. Woody Allen once told an interviewer, you know, that 80% of success is showing up. So please show up there too. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Class
you.
dismissed.